Hey everyone.
Hello, welcome to Istio Weekly. Thank you all for joining. Today, we'll be talking about how to customize and create new service level metrics in Istio. We'll have a dedicated time for Q&A after the presentation as always, so if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to get them answered. But before diving into the topic today, let's take a moment to cover some recent highlights in the mesh world. As always, see the show notes in the description below for details and links. So the big news is Istio 1.11 was released on August 12th. There's a bunch of stuff in there, so we'll do a quick rundown. The CNI plugin has been promoted to beta as a replacement for the Istio init container to set up sidecar networking via IP tables. Deploying the Istio init container requires elevated Kubernetes privileges, which can be problematic for compliance in a regulatory environment. The CNI plugin offers the same functionality without requiring those elevated Kubernetes privileges. Also, the external control plane capability has been promoted to beta in this release. This allows an external control plane to control the data planes of one or more clusters, separating concerns of mesh owners who administer the control plane from mesh users who deploy and configure services. The new gateway injection feature moves the management of gateways to the same method as sidecar proxies instead of the way it used to work as a separate deployment. There's also new documentation for installing gateways available. If you go to the latest docs, there's a new gateway setup page. Again, links will be available in the show notes. So revision and tag deployments have been updated. The Istio control tag command has graduated from experimental. 1.10 introduced revision tags to minimize errors when upgrading via Canary releases, which has been something you couldn't do multiple control planes since 1.6. There are also bug fixes and the introduction of new labels, Istio injection and sidecar.istio.io/inject as a replacement for injection annotations. Injection annotations are likely to be deprecated, so that's something to keep in mind for the future. 1.11 also adds experimental support for Kubernetes multi-cluster services, MCS. The Kubernetes MCS API, which is currently in alpha, aims to make multi-cluster services as easy to use as in-cluster services. Istio support for MCS allows for discoverability of service endpoints determined by client location and whether the service has been exported. This is the first phase of the plan to support MCS and Istio, so it's an ongoing project. It's experimental, but it looks very exciting to me. So onto events. We got a couple of things coming up in the next couple of weeks. Tetrate founding engineer Zach Butcher on August 25th in a discussion of the newly published NIST standards for attribute-based access control for microservices. Zach is a co-author on the NIST paper, special publication 800-204B, which describes recommendations and controls for ABAC in microservices-based applications. It was just finalized on August 6th. Zach will be talking about what's in the paper and what it means for folks, give you a chance to hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak, what the new access control standards are and what they mean for you, especially if you operate in a federally regulated environment. And then on August 31st, Tetrate will be hosting a panel of fintech leaders to discuss application security in a contactless world. what the unprecedented shift in payment technology from cash and card swipes to card taps and mobile apps, oh my God, I can't believe I wrote that, means for the financial technology and applications. And finally, we want to hear from you, as always. What else is happening in the service mesh world? What topics would you like us to cover here? Please leave your thoughts in the comments to the video and at GitHub. As always, links for these resources and more can be found in the description. And with that, I will hand the mic over to Peter.
Yay, awesome. Thank you, Ryan. I'll switch to my view of slides. And let's see. So today we'll talk about customizing Istio metrics. So I've spent a couple of afternoons looking into this, trying things out, figuring out the best way to explain how this works. And this is the result of that investigation. So we'll start with trying to understand what the basic concepts are. So on the slide here, I have a single metric. This metric is called Istio requests total. It is a counter metric, as what it does, it counts the number of requests. So if you see at the bottom, there's a counter that says 1, 2, 3. So this just means that there was 123 requests sent with these specific values. So Istio has a collection of standard metrics defined, right? So this Istio request total is just one metric, but there's other metrics such as request duration, request and response sizes, gRPC message counts, and so on. And I'll show you the webpage. It's on the Istio documentation, that whole list. So now, in addition to the metric name and the metric type, which is counter, each metric can also have 0 or more dimensions. So these dimensions are key value pairs, and they get collected together with the metric. So this metric on the slide has, let's say the response code is 200. That's a dimension that has a value of 200. There's also the source workload with a specific value, source app dimensions, and so on. By default, all these dimensions will be included in this Istio request total metric. Now, one thing that I want to note here is that a separate metric will be emitted in case any of these dimensions are different. So if there's another request that with a response code 200 and with all these dimensions exactly the same, the counter will increase. However, if there's a request, let's say to the same workload, from the same workload to the same destination, but the response code is, let's say 500, then we'll get another whole set of this Istio request total metric. The counter will be 1 in that example, but the dimension will be different. So the set of these default dimensions, as well as all the standard metrics, are defined in a WASM extension that's called stats. So this extension, this WASM extension, is built into Istio's Envoy proxy. And what it does, it creates these standard metrics in the set of dimensions and get the values from the dimensions from the requests that pass through the proxy. So the data for these metrics, for these attributes, is coming from Envoy. Now, we can control when these metrics are collected. So we can control if we want to collect these metrics on inbound traffic to the sidecar, on outbound traffic, or for gateway traffic as well. Or we could also say, well, we want to do any combination of these three. So when we install Istio, I'll show this in a demo, there will be an Envoy filter. The Envoy filter gets created. It's called stats filter. That one has all the configuration that configures this stats extension. And we'll look at how we can update that configuration through an Istio operator. I also have two screenshots here on the slide. On the left side, there's all these default metrics that are defined in the stats WASM extension. So there's request total, request duration milliseconds. And on the right side, we have all the default dimensions that get included in each one of these metrics. Now, how to customize these metrics. So this is what I was looking into. I was trying to figure out how can we customize this. So the way you do it is you have to configure the stats filter, right? Because the stats filter is the one that's where the collection is happening, right? There are two ways to do it. One is to create an Envoy filter. So we can create an Envoy filter and then configure the this istio.stats extension and provide the configuration for it like that, and then deploy the filter. The second option is to configure that stats Envoy filter gets created when Istio is installed. And the way to do that is through Istio operator. So we can modify the Istio operator and we can say, hey, in addition to all these standard metrics, I also want you to, I want to include these attributes. I want to create these new attributes. I want to create these new metrics and so on. So instead of fiddling with separate Envoy filters, you could just define this in an Istio operator, and then it's going to apply to your whole mesh globally, right? You could still use the Envoy filter, and then you also have an option in an Envoy filter to say, I just want to apply these metrics changes to some specific workloads. However, the cleanest way to do it is to use the operator. So in the configuration itself, there's the definitions field and the metrics field. The definition field is used to add new metrics. And then the metrics field is used to override existing metrics. And what that means is basically adding dimensions or removing dimensions from existing metrics. So let's talk about what can be customized. So the first thing or the first scenario is when you want to add some existing standard dimensions to existing metrics. For example, there's a attribute on Envoy that gets collected called request ID, right? So request ID gets generated by Envoy and it's collected for each request. So Envoy has information of the request ID. So that's an example of an existing attribute of an existing or standard dimension. So what you can do is we can add that request ID as a dimension to an existing metric like Istio requests total, for example. So these attributes, there's a whole set of them. They're being collected by Envoy, response size, headers, request duration, connection attributes, and so on. It's all well documented. So all these attributes, we can use these as values for our dimensions. Now, the second set is the peer metadata, and this is where you can get things such as the upstream or downstream pod name, namespaces, labels, and so on. Now, some of these attributes, because why would it be easy when it can be complicated, right? Some of these attributes are not automatically extracted into Prometheus. This is done for performance reasons, right? So there is a list of default tags. That list is defined in Istio, and these are the tags that are automatically extracted into Prometheus, right? So even if you're adding an existing attribute, something like request ID, however, you want to name that attribute as my super duper request ID, that name, my super duper request ID, will not be in the default list of stat tags. So what you'll have to do is you'll have to add some additional configuration to tell Istio that you want to extract that dimension into Prometheus. It'll make more sense once I show the demo, I promise. I noticed that I have the extra stat tags I have an annotation on the slide here. I think these annotations are getting deprecated. So the way to update this is through the Istio operator. So that was the first scenario where we're adding attributes to existing metrics. So the second scenario is creating new metrics. So this is where you can come up with your own metric name, you can come up with your own metric type, you can create a counter, a histogram, or a gauge. And finally, you can also define a value that evaluates to an integer and says whether you want to increment the metric value or not. So if you remember that 123 counter number that I had on the first slide, so in this value field, you can say, when do I want that number to increase? Now the value field is a string itself. So you can write things as I have in the slide. So you can say, I want to check if the request, if the method of the request starts with post. If it's a post request, I'm going to return 1, meaning I want to increase the counter. Otherwise, I'll return 0. And then the requested method, you can replace that with any of the attributes that I've talked about that can be any of the Envoy default attributes that are being collected. So once you have that, then you also have to register the metric. Again, the way to do this is either through an annotation on the pod deployment spec. However, that's being deprecated. So the way that you actually do this is through an Istio operator. So in the Istio operator, you can say, my new metric is the name of the metric, and I want to include all the metric that start with that name, or I want to use a regular expression, or you have 3 options, right, to register the metric so Istio knows about it, and it's going to get reported in the metrics as well. One note here about creating a new metric. So I got to this point, I was able to create a new metric, it was awesome. And then the next step was, well, let me figure out how can I add like some dimensions to this metric. So I spent a couple of hours on it and I wasn't able to figure it out. It just didn't work for me. I've tried all the different options, all the different combinations of everything. For some reason, I couldn't get it to work. There is a post that I posted on Slack, on Istio Slack, asking the same question. I haven't received any answers yet, but I'll make sure that we write a blog post because I really need to figure out how to do this. It's gotten to that point. I have to know how to do this. All right, and then the last scenario, I think, that I have is when you want to create a completely new attribute, right? You don't want to use like any of the attributes that you have that are coming from Envoy. They're useless to you. You want to create your own, right? You want to create a completely new attribute, and you want to be the one that decides what the condition is for a certain value to be set to that attribute. This can be configured through a different extension. The extension is called AttributeGen, and you can configure it through an Envoy filter. So you can create an Envoy filter configuration that configures this AttributeGen WASM extension, and in that configuration, you can say, I want to create a new attribute that's called Istio_myPath, and then you can specify a list of matches, right? Each match is a separate condition and value, right? So you can say, my Istio_myPath attribute, if the request URL path of the incoming request equals /API, I want the value of this new attribute to be API, right? Or if the request.status code is 500, I want the value to be 5xx, or whatever you want to come up with, whatever your scenario is. So you can define these. These will get, you can create this attribute. This will get evaluated. This will get populated. And then the same way that we would add an existing attribute or an existing dimension to the metric, you can use this newly generated newly generated attribute to be part of part of your metric through a dimension. Okay, and I think, yes, it's time for a demo. Let me switch to the demo here. If there's any questions or anything, feel free to ask on a YouTube chat. We are looking at it. I'm just looking at it. No one's asking anything, so I don't know if that's good or bad. So let me switch to code. Okay, so I have a default, just a demo Istio deployment. If you're trying this out, make sure you install Prometheus as well. You will have to use Prometheus for this in order to get the Prometheus style metrics out of it. I've also deployed a Hello World application that doesn't do anything, just returns Hello World. So let me show you the Envoy filter first. So there's the two metadata exchange filters, 1.10, 1.9. This is just for the backwards compatibility, I think. I have 1.10 Istio installed. Same for TCP. The one that we want to look at is the stats filter. So I'll just do get Envoy filter, name of the filter. It's in the Istio system namespace, and I'll just output YAML. All right, so let's look through this one. Okay, I'm not gonna look at that thing above, but so let's look at this spec here. So we're applying this config patch to HTTP filter. Note that this is where I said that you can apply it to either outbound, inbound, or gateway context, right? So in this case, we have the outbound context. And what we're doing here is, this is the actual configuration here. It's just setting debug to false and setting the stat prefix to Istio. Note on this one, so what this means is any metrics that will be generated will start with Istio underscore, right? Looking at the documentation, both of these seem deprecated. I've also looked into a code a little bit, and it seems like this is hard-coded to Istio anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Set it if you want it. It's still set by the default installation, but you're not missing anything if you don't include them. So this is the configuration for outbound traffic. Then we have the inbound one. And over here, we have some more meat, right? So we have this metrics field. If you remember from the slide, I've mentioned we have the metrics field and we have the definitions field. And with the metrics field, what we can do is we can update, augment, I guess, existing metrics, right? So what we're doing here is there's no name specified here. So what this means is that we want to add, because there's no name, we're not specifically calling out any existing metric, but we are defining these two additional dimensions. So what this means is for any metrics that get generated on inbound traffic, we want to add destination cluster dimension and the source cluster dimension. And you'll notice that this is coming from node metadata, which is something that's in the bootstrap information of the Envoy proxy, and I'll show that a bit later. And then we have the source cluster, which is coming from the downstream. Remember, we have downstream peer and upstream peer. And it's just taking the cluster ID value and it's populating these two dimensions, or I guess dimensions, attributes. And then down here we have the gateway for the gateway traffic. It's the same thing. I haven't looked at this one, what exactly it means, but disable host header fallback. I'm pretty sure it's documented. All right, so let's, so we've looked at this one. Let's look at the, so the Istio dash envoy. Actually, let me clear the screen. So get mesh, Istio dashboard envoy. So there's a dashboard that you could use to look at the metrics and all the envoy information. And I'm looking at for this Hello World deployment. Just want to show you here in the configuration dump. So remember the value that we had here for node metadata cluster ID. So this is being read from the bootstrap portion of Envoy configuration. So we have node, we have, what was node, metadata, and then we had the cluster ID here, right? So let's say if you wanted to include, I don't know, workload name or service cluster or parent shutdown duration, any of these values, right? You could get them using this notation, right? You could do node.metadata, and then depending on the type of the value of the field, you can get this value in. Also, I wanted to show the attributes. Let me just get the URL here. So these are all the attributes that Envoy generates. So they're separated by request, response attributes, connection attributes, and then upstream and downstream attributes, WASM attributes, and so on. So any of these values, you could use them as dimensions in your metric, or add them to existing metrics if you want. This is the source code for the Istio proxy. This is where these default attributes are actually defined. If you want to check them out here. And then I've also mentioned the standard metrics. This is on Istio's website, and I'll include all this in the notes and the descriptions. So these are the standard metrics that are being collected. So we'll be mostly looking at the request total. It's just a counter, but there's a bunch of other TCP traffic as well, and then the different labels. These are the attributes, right? That are used in the dimensions there. All right, so there's a question. Metrics will be scraped by Prometheus and not Grafana. Grafana has good Istio, but can you have a, yeah, you can, so Grafana is actually connecting to using Prometheus as its backend to get the metrics from there. And yes, Istio comes with, I think, 6 or 7 pre-built dashboards, but you can create your own dashboards in Grafana, right? You can connect to the same backend source, the same Prometheus instance, and then you can modify, you can create your own dashboards and graphs any way you want to do that. All right, so let's look at the first demo. So what I'll do in this one is I will add a dimension to an existing metric. So I'll do a kubectl apply, and before I click enter, we'll just go through it. This is the Istio operator. So these first 2, 4, 6, 7 lines, I guess. This is what I used to install Istio initially. So it's just a demo profile. Then I also installed Prometheus afterwards. Down here, let's look at the values first, and then we'll go back up. So we're going values, telemetry. So this is just augmenting the installation options, right? So we're overriding the config for the inbound sidecar. Remember, sidecar inbound, sidecar outbound gateway. So we could specify 3 different sections here if we wanted to. I'm just gonna modify it for inbound. It's the same thing. You would do it the exact same thing if you want to do it for the outbound as well as the gateway. And then metrics, right? So this is equal to that configuration that we saw in the stats Envoy filter. So this time I am providing the name of the metric. Note that I don't include Istio underscore because that stat prefix it's hard-coded to Istio. So the name is request total. So this is an existing metric already. And what I'm doing here is I'm adding two dimensions. I'm adding something called my request ID, which gets its value from the request ID attribute that's generated, collected by Envoy. And then I'm also adding, I'm running in GCP, but what I'm doing is I'm adding a location, GCP location attribute that gets its data from that bootstrap config. It gets the data from the node metadata, platform metadata, and then it reads in the GCP location. So let's deploy this. Let's look at the status. this will take maybe a couple of seconds. It's fairly fast. All right, so the installation is healthy, everything is good. Note that if something was wrong, you could look at the logs from the Istio operator pod. Sometimes what I've ran into is like you might have like an error or something in your configuration, but the operator will not actually start to reconcile it because it'll just show healthy, right? You're not going to know that. You might think that the configuration was applied, but it really wasn't. So make sure that if something's not working, look at the Istio operator logs first. All right, so we have this. Let's look at the get envoy filter. Let's look at the stats filter. Envoy filter, Istio system, YAML. And I'll scroll here to the sidecar inbound. Remember, this is what we modified in the Istio operator. And now notice this time that we have that actual configuration JSON that we specified in the operator, right? So it's being applied to the whole mesh. So let's see how this looks like. So if I grab the IP, and I'll just curl a couple of times to it, and then I will open dash envoy deploy hello world. So I'll just open the Envoy dashboard. And this time we'll look down at the stats. So there's a stats / Prometheus. We want to look at, that actually shows you the all the generated metrics in the Prometheus format. So if we look at the, okay. This is what happens. Still haven't figured out why this happens. Notice the name. But I know that the solution is to delete my pod for some reason. Let's do this one. Hello world. Just delete the pod. For some reason, it just collects this garbled. It used like this garbled name for the metric name. But you can clearly see that there's GCP location, right? There's the actual value of the location. There's the my request ID and the actual ID, the value, and then the actual name of the Istio request total of the metric. So let me just restart this, and now let's do like three requests, and then we'll open the dashboard again. And this time it should be clean. Yeah, there you go. Right. So I have I made 3 requests. I got 3 separate metrics reported. Each one has the counter set to 1. The reason I get 3 different is because the request IDs are different all the time, right? So that's why I get 3 different ones. But you'll see down here, we have the request ID, if I zoom in a little bit more, as an attribute, right? And then we also have this GCP location set here as an attribute as well, right? So once you have this, what you could do then later in Grafana, you could create a dashboard, create a graph with a nice drop down that says GCP location, for example, and then you could filter the request by, let's say, location, right? Location of your cluster or the pod, the cluster your pod is running in, I guess. Yeah. All right, so this was creating. Actually creating new, getting new attributes, right? Oh, and I just realized I didn't show you, I didn't went back to this. So let's go back to, well, I'll have to do it again. So let me just, so I'll paste the same. I'm not gonna deploy it again. I'll just paste it so I can show you, right? So this is the Istio operator I use. So I talked about this one. I forgot to mention this. So this is that extra stat tags that we also had to add, where we're basically saying, hey, by the way, we have these extra tags that I want you to automatically export to Prometheus as well, right? So this is just telling Istio, hey, we have these two things that haven't been defined before, so make sure you you extract them as well, right? So that the way you do it is through extra stat tags, right? I have this comment here that this is equivalent to this annotation, and yes, it does work. So you can do this on a specific deployment if you want to. However, I think this is getting deprecated, so make sure if you want to use this, make sure you like read through the docs and everything. All right, so let's go to the next example where we will create a new metric. So I'm not gonna add add attributes to the metric. I'll just create it. I'll show you how to do that. So it's the same thing. We have the same Istio operator. And then down here, instead of having the metrics field, we're now using the definitions field. And we're saying, I'm creating this new metric. It's called my custom metric. The type of it is counter. And then the value is this expression, right? So evaluate this expression, and then you're going to end up with either 1 or 0. So what this is saying is, if the request is a post request, I want my custom metric to be incremented. If it isn't a post request, then don't do anything, right? And then similarly as before, for attributes, you also need to register your new metric. And the way to do that is I'm using the inclusion prefix here. You could use inclusion suffix, or you can use inclusion regular expression, right? To just say, hey, includes this metric in the collection. Note that there's the Istio underscore here. So this is the actual name of the metric. It's not just this one, right? So it's the name plus that stat prefix that's hard-coded to Istio. All right, so let's deploy this one. Oh, there, lose connection. Okay. All right, so it's configured, and I'll delete this as well, just to make sure, so we don't get that nasty looking thing like we did before. And okay, let's look at so it's healthy. Hopefully it was all good. So let's make a couple of requests. So these are all get requests. Actually, let me go here and I'll just open the get mesh, stctl dash envoy deployment hello dash world. So let's open this one and look down in the Prometheus. So there you go, right? So we have this my Istio custom metric counter that we've created, right? Remember I made a couple of requests, but they were all get requests, so that's why the value didn't increment. The Istio request total was incremented, right? You can see it here. But now if I go back to this window, and if we just do -x post, if we do a post request a couple of times, and then go back here and refresh this one, you'll notice that the metric has actually incremented. Now, theoretically, if you wanted to add attributes to this new metric, you would do it the same way we've done it before. So let me just show you. I'll paste it in. We can try it. I don't know. Maybe Istio. Maybe I'll get lucky on the demo, but I probably won't. But we can try it, right? So I have this stat matcher. This is for the metric itself. I have these extra 2 stat tags that we defined in the previous demo. I have the definition. And then under metrics here, what I'm basically saying, this is my metric name, right? I want to add these 2 dimensions to this metric, right? And you can deploy this and you're not going to get any errors. However, you're not going to get any metrics either. So let's just see. I'm curious. Usually demos don't work well, but maybe this time my luck will change and it will work well. So let's do a couple of requests. Let's do post as well. And then I think this is still running. yeah, so it's not budging at all, right? So it's, for some reason it doesn't work adding metrics, but we'll figure it out. All right, last thing that I want to show is how to create a new attribute. So this is where I'm going to use the Istio AttributeGen WASM extension, and I will, let me see if I can open the code editor, because it is a bit lengthy. To, what do we call it? New attribute.yaml. Just paste it here. It makes it easier to read over here, because it is an envoy filter configuration, and these are usually fairly long, right? So we're creating new filter called new attribute, applying HTTP filter to inbound, only for proxies with 1.10 version. We're inserting it before stats. This is the name of the filter, and this is the actual configuration, right? So what we're doing here is we're creating an attribute called Istio my new attribute. It's a very unique name. And then we're defining the match conditions, right? So we're basically saying if request.method is get, so if it's a get request, set the value of this Istio my new attribute to get request. And then if the value of, like if the request.method is post, then set it to post request. You can imagine having like other different things here. You could check response.status code, right? Response.code, if it's 200, set it to this. Or you can say, if the request path starts with this or equals that, then set it to this one or set it to that one, right? A lot of combinations, right? So let's deploy this. And I'll go up here and we'll create this filter. And then once this is created, then we actually need to use it, right? So this is not doing anything. This is just generating the attribute. It's not being used anywhere. So use the similar example as before. So we'll create an Istio operator. Inbound sidecar, we'll update the existing metric, the request total, and we will add this new dimension. So the new dimension, so we'll use the name my method. We're also registering it up here. But then the value of this, remember last time we had like, we had that before, let me see, request.id, right? Or we had the node.metadata, platform metadata, right? This time we actually have the name of the attribute that we created, which is called Istio my new attribute. So let's do this. And what this one will do is if it's a get request, it will set that value to get request. And if it's a post request, it will set that value to the value of the attribute to post request. So let's wait for this one. Okay, so it's healthy. Let's make a couple of post requests. Let's make a couple of get requests. And if this one is still up and running, actually, let me restart this here. I might have to restart the pod as well. Oh, let's go down here. And Istio requests total. Oh yeah, we have to. I don't know why this happens. Delete pod label app equals hello world. World. Let's do this one. I guess the proxy needs to be restarted. That's why. All right, and then let's see, this one is up and running. Okay, now we have to reopen the dashboard again, and we'll have to make a couple of requests again. So let's do a couple of get requests, and then let's make a couple of post requests. And let's open the dashboard. And we'll switch down here to Prometheus, and then we'll look at the Istio requests. And then you'll notice down here, there is a attribute called my method. It has a value of get request, right? And we made 3 get requests, and then down here we also made 3 post requests as well, right? And this is the attribute that gets added. And this is something that you could, like, whatever your use cases are, your scenarios, right? You could decide to create your own attributes with your own values, and then you can use those in your reporting and your dashboards. And hopefully, once I get that answers, you can also use these new attributes in your new metrics that you've created. Let's see if I have any. I don't think I have any other. I'll include any other links. I guess I have this one, but this is just this is the definition of this stats extension that gets built into the proxy. So all the code, if you're curious how it works, and if you enjoy reading C++, you can go through it. All right, let's switch back. This was my demo. I'm just trying to find my window here. We'll switch back to the slides, and we'll bring Orion back. Any questions while I find the slides?
Vivek says metrics will be scrapped by Prometheus.
Yeah, I answered that one. Yeah, we answered. Yeah, so yeah, Prometheus, Grafana uses it as its data source, and then you can create your own metrics. Your own dashboards with your own metrics, attributes, however you want to do it. All right, so that was it for the demo. Orion.
Yes, well, thanks, Peter, for putting together the presentation. We hope you found it useful. And we hope you'll join us in the next installment, episode 10 of Istio Weekly, where we chat with one of Tetrade's first certified Istio administrators about what the test was like, how he prepared, and how certification exams are useful in learning new technologies and acquiring new skills. And so join us then. You can find the Istio Weekly schedule as well as past episodes at istioweekly.com. And we put tutorial material up on GitHub at github.io/tetradelabs.io/istioweekly. And you can chat with us on the Get Istio channel in the Istio Slack workspace, slack.istio.io, or leave a comment on this video. Thanks again, Peter.
All right, thank you. See you in 2 weeks. Bye.